don't expect you to know much about Singapore. It's very different from Poland. We're a small island nation with a population of 5.8 million, densely packed onto 700 square kilometers. Poland has got 38 million population, which is 6.5 times ours, and a land area which is more than 400 times Singapore's size. Singapore has a remarkable story in economic development, transforming herself from a third world to a first world economy in less than 50 years. And GDP grew very sharply from 700 million in the 1960s to 370 billion in 2019. And the per capita GDP was only $600 in the 1960s. It's now 65,000 and among the highest in the world. So Singapore is now a modern metropolis and a global financial center, well connected to the world through a very busy seaport and airport. Singapore has adopted different strategies at different periods in her economic development, starting with cheap labor policy in the 60s, to a skills intensive kind of economy in the 70s, capital intensive in the 80s, technology intensive in the 90s, and now knowledge and innovation type of economy. So starting in the early 90s, when the economic conditions were more stable, Singapore started planning ahead for the future by building up research and innovation capability. The government set up an agency called the National Science and Technology Board, NSTB, to do this. I was in the original management team that was given the task to put up the first 5-year National Technology Plan in 1991. And this practice of 5-year plans has continued since. We are now at the tail end of the 6th plan, RIE 2020, and the next plan, RIE 2025, will be launched soon. By the end of the 90s, Singapore had a reasonable research and innovation structure for her size. Research was carried out at the universities, applied R&D in a dozen or so public research institutes, and the government actively encouraged companies in Singapore, both multinational corporations based here and small and medium enterprises, to carry out R&D through various grants and incentives. A major milestone in our innovation journey occurred in 1999 when the NSTB launched a program called T21 for Technopreneurship for the 21st century. The aim is to move Singapore from a capital-intensive manufacturing and services economy to a globally competitive knowledge economy with a strong technopreneurship sector. This was pushed from the top. It was championed by the Deputy Prime Minister, who chaired a T21 ministerial committee and is backed by $1 billion of funds. The NSTB was the implementing agency and identified 4 areas to work on. And this became known as the 4 pillars of T21. So let me talk briefly about each one. The first pillar is a pro-enterprise business environment. For entrepreneurship to flourish, the business regulatory environment must be super friendly. So the NSTB thoroughly scanned rules governing business operation with the purpose of making them friendly and less onerous so that it is easy to do business in Singapore. And indeed, for many years, Singapore has been rated as the top country in the world for the ease of doing business. And in addition, new ideas were implemented to make it easy to start a business. For example, you could start a business from the home. And also there was an entrepreneurial visa that was introduced to allow foreigners who want to start businesses in Singapore to be given a visa. Second pillar is equity financing. For startups to grow, there must be sufficient investors. So the mission of this pillar was to develop the local venture capital industry. The $1 billion was invested in various VC funds all over the world, US, Europe, Israel, so that we're able to learn as limited partners of the fund the best practices globally. And also some of this money was also used to seed new VC funds in Singapore by committing money as the first LP to venture capital funds. Third pillar is physical facilities. Entrepreneurs benefit from a conducive and supportive environment. with a concentration of technology and talent. So certain areas of Singapore were designated as innovation hubs to bring high-tech entities together to achieve synergy. For example, there's the Biopolis, which has a concentration of public and private research institutes in biotech, together with drug and pharma companies. There's Block 71, which has a concentration of startups, VCs, incubators, etc. And these are located close to universities that supply the talent pool, for example, the NUS as well as the INSEAD Business School. Finally, the fourth pillar is an education system that encourages creativity and innovation. Now, this is much harder to do and will require time. And the intent is to instill a culture of experimentation and acceptance of failure. Also, support and incentives were provided for universities to spin out companies from their research. So activities under the four pillars had great impact and momentum. And T21 coincided with the dot-com period in the late 90s. So lots of startup companies were formed in Singapore as elsewhere. And there was an incredible amount of buzz. I recall when we organized T21 networking sessions, hundreds of people would show up. Startup founders, aspiring entrepreneurs, researchers, angel investors, VCs, lawyers, etc. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, the exuberance didn't last. The dot-com crash in 2000 affected everybody, including the startups in Singapore. And this was followed by 9/11, and so the whole entrepreneurship environment dried up almost instantly. For the few years following that until the mid-2000s, there was hardly any startup or venture capital activity in Singapore. But Singapore persevered in pushing for entrepreneurship. We were down, but certainly not out. Our effort in innovation and entrepreneurship was revived again in 2006 with the establishment of the National Research Foundation, which is chaired by none other than the same DPM who championed the T21 program, Dr. Tony Tan, who later became Singapore's first elected president in 2011. So the NRF was set up with a new budget of about $4 billion on top of existing R&D budgets to boost the RIE significantly. The NRF initiated several large-scale R&D programs, but also set aside funding for innovation and entrepreneurship via a program called the National Framework for Innovation and Enterprise, NFIE. Essentially, the NRF undertook a holistic study of the entire innovation process in the country, from the initial idea through to R&D and commercialization in the market, to determine where weaknesses or gaps exist and where government could do something about that. So there was a suite of support programs which were created to address the weaknesses and gaps in the innovation life cycle. For example, there's a University Innovation Fund, which gives universities resources to develop the entrepreneurship curriculum, to speed up the tech licensing programs, and to encourage spin-off companies. There's the proof of concept grants, translational grants, to support efforts to bring research to the market. I will talk about two programs that I think had the most impact in rapidly growing the number of startups in Singapore. These were not new ideas, these were ideas we adapted and learned from what we saw in Israel. The first is the Tech Incubation Scheme, or TIS, where we invited experienced business executives to set up incubators to guide young and inexperienced startups in their early development to reduce the chances of failure. And this is how the program works. The government, through the NRF, co-funds 85% of the seed capital in the startup with the incubators. And this reduces the incubators' risk greatly because with the same money for one startup, they could now invest in 5 or 6. On top of that, the NRF gives them the option to buy out her stake so that they could take all the potential upside if the startup succeeds. So this was a super attractive deal, and essentially the government takes the large risks on the downside of 85% while giving the incubators the upside for success. And not surprisingly, this attracted a lot of experienced tech executives and high net worth individuals to start incubation companies and invest in startups. The reason why the tech incubation scheme works is because it was designed to align the interests of all parties in the same direction. The startups, of course, get the seed investment they want, and importantly, guidance during their most vulnerable seed stage. The incubator managers spread their money over many more companies by leveraging on government money, therefore greatly reducing their risk. And the government bears most of the downside risk, but that's okay because that's part of the development effort to build up the startup ecosystem. However, nobody wins unless the startup succeeds, and this means that everyone's effort is directed in the same direction to ensure the startup success. And indeed, many good startups have come out of this program. Another program that addresses equity financing is the Early Stage Venture Fund. Here, the government through the NRF commits $10 million as a limited partner to a number of selected VC funds, provided they raise at least as much from other sources. And this was also structured similarly to give the VCs the option to buy back the government's portion and take the upside if they believe the investments are going to be successful. So with the launch of the scheme, 6 new early-stage venture funds were created, making available at least $120 million in Series A funding for startups in Singapore. As a result of this and other programs under the NFIE, hundreds of startups got funded in the following years. Some were spin-offs from the universities and research labs, some came out of industry. Interestingly, there were also entrepreneurs from the region and elsewhere, including Europe, relocating to Singapore to take advantage of the developing ecosystem. Well, the period also coincided with the rise of startup activity worldwide, so again, the momentum greatly picked up. Many of the early incubators and venture funds then went on to raise bigger funds, having built up their track record with the NRF programs. By the mid-teens, lots of venture funds were started and there were accelerators everywhere. Young people become much less risk-averse and were willing to try working in a startup rather than taking up a big company or government job. There might even be a bit of a cool factor to have founded a startup or worked in one and looks good on the CV. But the change is real. I've been teaching entrepreneurship at the university for 20 years, and I could see how the attitudes of students towards startups has changed. There were also many other initiatives that fit on these programs. NUS, for instance, has a successful program which sends hundreds of students every year to intern for 1 full year in startups in entrepreneurial hotspots like Silicon Valley, New York, Tel Aviv, Beijing. The returnees from this program have been responsible for a lot of startups coming out of the university over the years. At the School of Computing, where I'm located, we encourage students to work on startup ideas while in school by providing a $10,000 grant to them to get started, plus incubation space for the companies and mentorship from experienced entrepreneurs and faculty. So across the entire university, hundreds of such grants are given each year, spawning a steady stream of new startups with each cohort of students. At the national level, the Singapore government is now concentrating startup support programs under one agency known as Enterprise Singapore, which has schemes supporting every stage of the startup's journey, at the proof of concept, incubation, seed investment, Series A, growth capital, etc. Today, the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Singapore is quite rich. Hundreds of VCs are operating out of Singapore, investing in the country and the region of Southeast Asia, which is becoming quite a vibrant entrepreneurship region. About 15 billion VC investments was recorded last year, and there were many accelerators operating here, and a large and growing pool of angel investors, numerous startup events in the calendar throughout the year, and universities are all actively promoting entrepreneurship. Well, this is the brief story about Singapore's journey in building the ecosystem for innovation and entrepreneurship up to this point. In our experience, government can be effective in stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship by taking an ecosystem development approach, doing the following: continuing investments in research, innovation, and enterprise, having enterprise-friendly business regulations, building comprehensive support infrastructure, whether in terms of physical spaces like science parks, or support services such as IP management, legal services, etc. Promoting a culture willing to experiment and accept failure. Government programs are most effective if they are run by the private sector, but the parameters must be designed carefully to ensure that the interests of all parties are properly aligned. And of course, all this takes time and sustained commitment, and ecosystem cannot just appear overnight. Pursuing all these initiatives properly will set the flywheel in motion. The different programs will reinforce each other to create a rich and vibrant innovation ecosystem over time. Finally, openness is also important. It helps that Singapore is a modern, cosmopolitan city attractive to high-tech professionals. Because of our size, we can never match the scale of Silicon Valley, New York, or Beijing, but we can be an important and competitive node in the global innovation network, and that's what we seek to be. Thank you.